Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 7th of July and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First this evening we will look at today's coronavirus update, and then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will look at the news headlines together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,314,602 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,010,955 have been confirmed negative, and 303,647 have tested positive. There are 3,799 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm sorry to say that there are 5 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive in Scotland. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection in total now stands at 7,740. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the past 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 387 were in hospital last night, 34 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,890,176 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,808,902 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 128,301 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 33 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now, as it's Wednesday, we also have an update from National Records of Scotland. As at the 4th of July, 10,189 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to the statistics published by National Records of Scotland today. In the week between the 28th of June and the 4th of July, there were 21 deaths registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, and that is an increase of 4 deaths from the previous week. 4 deaths were aged under 65, 6 were aged 65 to 74, and there were 11 deaths in people aged over 75. 9 were female and 12 were male. 15 deaths were in hospitals, 4 deaths were in care homes, and 2 deaths were at home or in a non-institutional setting. The number of deaths from all causes in Scotland in this week was 1,076. That's 50 or 5% more than the rolling 5-year average. Now, having looked at the coronavirus update, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a great friend of the programme, Roger Mullin.
Good evening.
Roger,
how are you?
Hello, Roger. I'm very well, thank you. How are you this evening?
I'm doing not too bad.
That's grand. Roger, I should say, was the SNP MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath and is now a writer, a business advisor and an activist. So, Roger, it's great to have you, and we'll start to have a look at the headlines in Scotland at 7 together now. Our first story is that the SNP has challenged the Tories over their handling of lucrative emergency COVID contracts and the rampant cronyism at the heart of the UK government. The party's Westminster leader warned that the lack of details published over the issuing of emergency contracts raised serious questions that the UK government can no longer dodge, and that as a result, the Prime Minister must immediately commence the COVID-19 public inquiry. There have been countless reports in the media that close contacts, friends and party donors of the Tory party have received multi-million-pound contracts with little accountability or scrutiny. The Tory government have faced criticism over their alleged misuse of public funds following revelations that Michael Gove instructed officials to use emergency COVID contracts and taxpayers' money to carry out political research into attitudes to the UK Union. The SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP could barely contain his anger when he said that throughout the course of this pandemic, Boris Johnson's Tory government has stumbled from one scandal to another, and with each scandal emerging, a pattern of rampant cronyism at the heart of this government has appeared. Mr. Blackford added that time and time again, serious questions have been raised over how the Tory government has handed taxpayer money, with allegations that multi-million-pound emergency COVID contracts were given out to friends, party donors and close contacts. And he said that each time the UK government has failed to give the details of the process behind the issuing of these emergency contracts. He said they can no longer continue to dodge accountability. So, Roger, first of all, what do you think we can best do about this cabal of cronies, family and friends?
Well, I think the best we can do is, of course, to get Scottish independence so that we're not mired in this type of corruption, which is what it is, in the future. In terms of the short run, it's very difficult to stop a Tory government hell-bent on behaving in this way when they've got a clear majority in the Commons and when they don't have an effective official opposition in the Labour Party. So I think actually what has been undertaken by Ian Blackford and his colleagues over the last week or so, calling out this type of corruption, is probably about as much as we can do at the moment, make people aware of it. But unfortunately, we don't have the power to intervene to stop it.
Of course. And thinking for a moment about the dynamic between Westminster and Holyrood, how do you think Ian Blackford can channel his righteous anger to best effect?
Well, I think one thing I would like to see, given my experience of being an MP some years ago, is I would like to see closer working between members of Parliament in Westminster and the members of the Scottish Parliament so that they can get on the same page in some of these issues. Part of the problem, I think, is that at the moment, some of these responsibilities for awarding of contracts are split between, on the one hand, the Treasury, which is under Westminster, and on the other hand, there are some areas of responsibility for the Scottish Government in the awarding of its own contracts. There's been no criticism of the Scottish Government in the way in which there is a criticism of Boris Johnson's Tories, of course. So I think the more we can get concerted action, both in Westminster and in Holyrood, the more we begin to make an impact in the consciousness of the Scottish people.
Absolutely. Can you think of circumstances before where the government has set up a VIP lane in order to award government contracts to MPs, family and friends?
I'm not particularly aware offhand of particular examples from away in the past. What I'm more concerned about is actually this pattern of behaviour, because it goes beyond even what Ian has been talking about, Ian Blackford has been talking about in Parliament. It's not just about the awarding of contracts, it's the type of contracts that are being awarded and their conditions. So that, for example, I've been concerned for some time about stories that first appeared in The Guardian and in Radio 4 about things called mini umbrella companies that are getting downstream contracts. And what they are doing is they're operating in such a way as they are avoiding taxation. They're creating to the tax gap. And the Guardian has estimated that this type of scam could have cost the Treasury upwards of £4 billion in recent years. So the problem is not just the cronyism. The problem is when the contracts are awarded, particularly to companies that don't have the skills to undertake them, what they then do is they subcontract to their pals, and their pals subcontract to their pals. And you shouldn't begin to get a trail. And the loser in all of this is the ordinary citizen, as the taxpayer, because it's the taxpayer that's being ripped off right, left and centre.
Of course, without doubt, those who wish to exploit these circumstances will be structuring their transactions and their operations in the most tax efficient manner. Of course, you would expect that it would be incumbent upon the West, in particular the Westminster procurement organisations, to be guarding against that?
Well, you would have thought actually there are three groups who should be guarding against it. You rightly said, Andrew, it should be those who are doing the procurement. But there's also a role here for HMRC, and there's also a role for Companies House in terms of who's getting the contracts and are they fit and proper organisations. And I can find no evidence that this triumvirate are operating effectively to prevent this kind of corruption going on. And that's also part of the problem. Part of the problem is we don't have the infrastructure in place with a commitment to ensure that the public purse is being well controlled and used for appropriate purposes.
Of course, and I recall, Roger, you've campaigned before about the challenges that are presented by the lack of transparency that is attendant with Scottish limited partnerships. Is this another area in which we should see coordination between Holyrood and SNP MPs in Westminster in terms of focusing on the corporate structures that may be being abused here?
Yes, well, I think they are being abused. I mean, unfortunately, Scottish limited partnerships are still operating with impunity in terms of tax evasion and being a front for criminality, as are other financial vehicles. And so it's little surprising, for example, that the UK doesn't rate in the top 10 of least corrupt countries in the world. It continually operates at a much lower standard in terms of corruption than a lot of people are willing to recognise. And this is an area that I continue to research in. But I mean, if we go back to the point you initially raised, Andrew, when you were quoting Ian Blackford, the problem is this is not a news story in the sense that corruption of this sort has been going on for many years. And it's never been something that any UK government have given priority to stopping.
Of course, the priorities appear to be elsewhere and appear to be focused on, for example, either using government money to reward friends and family, or alternative, and at the same time, perhaps misusing government money for political purposes. We touched briefly on the apparent instructions from Michael Gove to use COVID contracts to carry out polling and political research. Is that just another example of the more very senior Tories in Westminster playing fast and loose with taxpayers' money?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think you raise a very, very good example there, Andrew. This is money supposedly allocated for a particular purpose and being used for an entirely different one without appropriate scrutiny. This has been happening in other fields as well. I know that many people who are concerned about the aid budget are concerned not just about the UK government cutting it, but that some of that money through the aid budget is being used for purposes other than aid, for example, to support some types of military activity. So this is a fundamental problem of governance, a fundamental problem of how a government operating in our name, using our taxpayers' money, is choosing to husband those resources. And in my view, they are not choosing to husband them in a way that stands up to scrutiny, which is probably why they don't want any scrutiny.
Of course, of course. Well, we'll move on to our second story this evening, which is a story that's broken during the day, and that is that European leaders and press freedom campaigners have condemned the shooting of the journalist Peter de Vries on a busy Amsterdam street, and are demanding that his attackers face justice as the veteran Dutch crime reporter fights for his life in hospital. This is a crime against journalism, an attack on our values of democracy and rule of law, the head of the European Council, Charles Michel, tweeted. We will relentlessly continue to defend the freedom of the press. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, offered her thoughts and solidarity to the 64-year-old reporter and his family, while the European Parliament President, David Sassoli, said attacks against journalists are attacks against all of us. Peter de Vries became famous for reporting the kidnapping of the millionaire brewer Freddie Heineken in 1983, and is a national figure in the Netherlands. He had his own TV show for 17 years, working with victims' families, pursuing unsolved cases, and exposing miscarriages of justice. Mr. de Vries was shot up to 5 times, including once in the head, shortly after leaving a TV studio at about 7:45 p.m. on Tuesday. Police today said that 2 men arrested on the A4 motorway soon after the shooting in the centre of the Dutch capital, a 35-year-old Polish national and a 21-year-old Dutchman, were in custody and would appear before a judge on Friday. The pair are suspected of direct involvement in the attack, a police statement said. An 18-year-old man from Amsterdam, who was also arrested on Tuesday night, has been released and is no longer a suspect in the shooting. The journalist's condition, which was described on Tuesday evening as critical, at the scene of the shooting on the Lange Leidse of Amsterdam's central Leidseplein, shocked residents who have laid flowers and lit candles. The shooting of Peter de Vries is the fourth serious attack. The shooting of Peter de Vries is the fourth serious attack on a journalist in the EU in the past few years. Do you think, is there a lesson for our democracies in this?
Yes, and some of us will remember many years ago, for example, when there was a similar shooting of an Irish investigative journalist, a young woman who was killed, and subsequently a film made about it. There does seem to be a fundamental problem here. As organised crime gets bigger and bigger, they become more and more ruthless in the way in which they want to protect their criminal activities. And of course, one of the things that is a danger to them is the more that people understand what they're doing and have this scrutiny of the public brought to bear. So that's entirely against their interests. And so we're seeing more and more attacks on journalists, and indeed I would say on others as well. Some basic researchers and the like in different institutions have been attacked as well. So that this is a great challenge to democracy. I'm sure everybody listening this evening, our thoughts are with Peter de Vries and his family, and we wish him well. But this is a matter that needs much greater attention. But it needs attention at an international level. There needs to be much more cooperation internationally. And my first thought when I heard of this tragic event was, at this time when we need more international cooperation because of organised crime, what is the UK doing? We are having our Brexit. We are cutting some of our cooperation links and matters of security and the like. So we are headed in the wrong direction, I'm sad to say.
Yes, of course, Roger. You make a good point there about the end, which perhaps we can expand upon. Certainly, in the circumstances relating to the murder of Daphne Galizia in Malta, it's becoming clear that we're seeing there the intersection between organised crime and high politics as well. And I wonder if the challenges that, as you say, the reduction in cooperation by the UK in organisations such as Europol and the sharing of data and access to databases which help in the detection and prevention of crime across Europe. Do you think that there is a political angle or a political aspect to the decisions that are being taken, especially in light of, as I say, the killing of Miss Galizia in Malta a few years ago?
Yes, well, unfortunately, what you find in many parts of the world, that there is a connection between organised crime and some parts of what we might loosely call the political establishment. People who get influence or who are seeking political influence can sometimes think that it is of benefit to them to be associated with people who could supply them with lots of money to pursue their political ambitions. So this is not anything that is particularly new, but it is something that I think is on the rise in general because of the sheer scale of organised crime at an international level that we haven't really seen to the same extent as we're beginning to see it over, say, the last 10 years or so. So I think there are fundamental questions here. Nobody's got all the answers, but I think the answers, from my point of view, must lie in finding ways to better cooperate, to finding ways and better to link up security strategies and security cooperation. I cannot think that going down a pathway of reducing cooperation can do anything than provide succor to organised crime.
Absolutely right, Roger. And as we say, as we've been saying, the effrontery of shooting anyone on a busy street, it would be like shooting somebody in Argyle Street in Glasgow or Rose Street in Edinburgh, is shocking. And as you say, your thoughts and all of our thoughts are with Peter de Vries and his family at this time, and we'll keep him and them in our thoughts as the story develops. We'll move now to the next story, which is that the total value of Scotland's goods exports for the year ending March 2021 decreased by 22%. That's slightly more than £7 billion to £25.6 billion when compared with the previous 12 months. The UK overall also recorded a fall of 15%. Scotland's decrease was driven by a fall in exports of oil and gas, which were down 46%. That's about £6 billion. Scotland's annual goods exports to the EU decreased by 19% to £13 billion. The EU exports of food dropped 11%, while drinks decreased by 12%. However, exports to the EU of machinery and transport equipment were up 16% and chemicals up 9%. In the first quarter of 2021, Scotland's goods exports to the EU decreased by 18%, which is about £700 million, to £3.1 billion compared to the same period in 2020. Food exports decreased by 27% and drinks by 13%. Exports of machinery and transport rose by 15% and chemicals by 6%. The Trade Minister Ivan McKee said, "Today's goods export figures further demonstrate the combined impact of COVID-19 and Brexit on Scotland's trade. While exports from Scotland's onshore economy are down 5% over the past year, this compares favourably with a reduction across the rest of the UK of 14%, demonstrating the work done to support Scottish exporters through our export growth plan, A Trading Nation." Meanwhile, suggestions the UK government could extend truck drivers' working hours have been criticised as a threat to workers' rights and a risk to safety and drivers' well-being. The Road Haulage Association said that changes in driving times are not the answer to the challenges facing the sector. So, Roger, first of all, how in general terms do you assess these perhaps disappointing trade statistics?
Well, I think under the circumstances of the double whammy of a pandemic and of Brexit, it's understandable that there's going to be a contraction in our ability to do international trade. And of course, if you look beyond the confines of the UK, you will find that many countries are finding similar types of difficulty. However, what I would say is if you look at the annual trade figures and you take account of not merely exports, but also imports, that tells you a really interesting story. Over the most recent year, even with these problems, Scotland's exports have been estimated by the UK government to be £1 billion more than our imports. Contrasted with England, where the estimates are that imports have been 24 billion greater than exports. So that the picture here is very varied. But I would agree with Ivan McKee. It was a few years ago that Ivan and the Scottish government launched their trade strategy called A Trading Nation. Indeed, I was fortunate enough to be invited along to that launch. Those listening to this programme might not know precisely what's involved in that. Well, Scotland, with a lot of analysis, including from Fraser of Allender Institute, identified 12 major priority countries that we would devote resources to supporting businesses to export. And it strikes me that part of the reason our relative export-to-import performance has held up well is because the strategy launched by Ivan McKee and the work that himself and his department have done have certainly contributed to helping us to hold our own, but under extraordinarily difficult international conditions. What we've all got to look to, of course, is the future. As we move out of the pandemic, we hope that will improve circumstances. However, on the downside is we know that some of the negative effects of Brexit are going to increase. And, the latter point you made, for example, about the impact in recruiting lorry drivers and the like is an example of that. So, although things hopefully will improve because of the coming of vaccines and improvement in the pandemic, a lot of us are still very concerned about what the long-term impact of Brexit is going to be.
Absolutely, Roger. Do you think that these most recent trade statistics, do they underline the message that the needs of the Scottish economy and the people of Scotland are distinct from the needs and the demands of the English economy? And so, because, as you point out, Scotland is an exporting nation, whereas the UK as a whole and England in particular are not.
Yes, I mean, what we've got to recognise is that the structure of our business sector, the structure of our economy is different. Our asset base is very rich and is also different. Our location, our geography gives us certain advantages, although we are not exploiting those advantages because we don't have the powers to do so at the moment. But I think what we need to do is look in the longer run that, although things could be a lot better, we still have a very substantial base upon which to build upon. But that can only be built upon if we begin to make the decisions to suit the particular needs of the Scottish economy and of the Scottish people. And that's why Scottish independence is such a key to the future of everybody's well-being who lives in Scotland.
Of course, thank you, Roger. We'll move on to the next story now. And in questioning at the Work and Pensions Committee this morning, Therese Coffey MP confirmed that from late September, the UK government will phase out the £20 a week universal credit uplift and will not extend it to legacy benefits, despite calls from numerous anti-poverty charities. The SNP Work and Pensions spokesperson David Linden MP has slammed the decision, urging Boris Johnson to reconsider or face monumental consequences. A report from the Institute for Public Policy Research, published in May, found that the UK's relative poverty rate among working households had reached a century peak of 17.4%, with 1 in 6 working households now languishing in poverty. Mr Linden reiterated the SNP stance that the UK government must U-turn on the cruel plans to cut universal credit this autumn. So, Roger, if this cut does go ahead, it will mean that jobless social security will be at the lowest level in real terms for 30 years. What does this tell us about this particular Tory government in London, do you think?
Well, the first thing it tells us is they don't care about people who are not earning large sums of money, that they're willing to have them be the people who are going to have to pay the price for the way in which those who are much better off are being well rewarded by the Tory government. I mean, your first story you raised this evening, Andrew, about handing out contracts to their pals, doing that at the same time as saying we're going to take £20 a week away from the people living in the most difficult of circumstances, tells you all you need to know about the values of the Tory party. Of course, and so this raises a fundamental moral question, but it's also an economic one. It doesn't make any economic sense in the longer run. People need to be at a certain level of income and a certain amount of stability in their lives if they're going to be successful, for example, in finding and getting new jobs and building careers and supporting their families. So it doesn't make any sense in terms of the values we would want in our society, but it also doesn't make any sense in terms of our long-term economic interest.
Absolutely right, Roger. And this, I wonder if there's a pattern emerging here now as well, where in this, with regard to this decision, it appears that the Westminster government is fixing a date first before we have any real data on joblessness or the economy in September. And so, do you think that this is just more of the same from Westminster? By which I mean making decisions apparently with the papers in mind rather than the interests of the people?
Uh, well, I certainly think that is part of the story. Part of the story is that they like to seek such good headlines as they can get, although they're going to have some difficulty in this arena, at least with the general public, although it might be popular with some of their pals. But yes, I think there is quite a lot in what you say, Andrew.
We'll continue with our next story, which is in a similar area, and that is that there have been calls for the UK government to deliver meaningful support to individuals and businesses who have found themselves excluded from the financial support throughout the pandemic. Owen Thompson MP, in a debate in the House of Commons today, highlighted the government's failure to support over 3 million people across the United Kingdom, none of whom were granted access to the Job Retention Scheme, that's furlough, or the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme back in May 2020. Despite campaigning for over a year on the issue, alongside grassroots organisations including Excluded UK and We Make Events, an estimated 10% of the UK workforce are still waiting for any meaningful support package from the UK Tory government to help them through the crisis. The SNP MP is now urging Boris Johnson to finally take meaningful action to assist these businesses as restrictions ease, or face a growing poverty, debt, and mental health crisis. So, Roger, if something like 10% of the UK workforce has been excluded from support from Westminster, is this yet another example of the Westminster government either outsourcing its responsibilities or, perhaps more accurately, avoiding its responsibilities?
Yes, I find this one extremely difficult to understand what any kind of rationale is behind this from a UK government point of view. We know that many thousands of the people who are excluded in Scotland are people who are self-employed. And self-employed people are often on the first rung of being the entrepreneurs that any society needs if it wants to flourish in the longer term. And to have them excluded from support is going to make it impossible for them to return to the same types of activities that they were undertaking previously, or at least make it extremely difficult. So it doesn't make any sense from my point of view in terms of long-run economy when you would think policies should be geared towards, in the future, being able to come out of this circumstance of a pandemic as quickly as possible to get the economy back on its feet. Their actions in having so many people excluded from support at the current time is certainly not going to give us the platform we need to come back as strongly as we should want to. So my difficulty with the actions of the UK government is not just a moral one, is I cannot see that it has made any sense. It doesn't make any long-term economic sense to have these people excluded from support.
Absolutely, and it certainly strikes me as peculiar because we had, as a matter of conservative dogma for many years, that people should be self-employed and should work in their own small businesses. And here we see these same people now being excluded from any support at all from Westminster. It seems at best contradictory and more likely intended, or it's going to have the effect of damaging significant numbers of people and families as we even through 2021 if the challenges of the pandemic reduce. But we'll move to another Westminster story now, and an MP has highlighted a series of shocking failures in the UK government's hostile environment immigration policy in a debate in Westminster today. Anne McLaughlin MP pointed out that many highly skilled migrants have been left in legal limbo, denied indefinite leave to remain, and therefore unable to work, rent, drive, or access public funds, sometimes due to tiny historic discrepancies in HMRC records, which may have been shared between Whitehall departments without proper consent. Ms McLaughlin has uncovered cases where individuals with a discrepancy as little as £1.20 on their record years before have been denied indefinite leave to remain as a result. So firstly, Roger, without distracting from the news and moving to the sport, we know that in about 25 minutes' time, an England squad, which has been built squarely on immigration, will be taking the field. And what does that say about do you think, the way in which this, the Tory implementation of the hostile environment, how do you think it stands against an England that is, or a UK that is clearly multicultural and depends upon my immigrants?
Well, you draw it in a very interesting context, given what's about to happen and when's the kickoff in about 25 minutes' time. So I hadn't thought on it in that way, Andrew. But let me reflect on it. I mean, what does that tell you about England? It tells you that they wanted to get the best talent they could get their hands on so that they could perform at their best. And that's something I have been arguing about in terms of Scotland for years. I would like to see Scotland as a whole become the most talent-friendly country in the world, being able to attract the people with skills, with investment, with entrepreneurial endeavour that at the moment are being turned away, when if we could allow them to come here, if we could bring them into Scotland, it would help us flourish in the future, and not least because without being an open and talent-friendly country, we face on our own a significant demographic challenge. With an ageing population and without sufficient numbers coming through into our working population, if we don't attract people from overseas who wish to come here. So, I think your analogy with the England team is actually a very good one. I wish I had thought on it.
Not to worry, not to worry. And thinking a little bit further about this question, we've been hearing Tory MPs over the last few days talking at length about freedoms, and they've been talking about freedoms in the context of removing or reducing the restrictions that are on us all as a result of the pandemic. So whilst they're busy talking about individual freedoms in that sense, they appear to be at the same time entirely happy with possibly some of the most extreme authoritarian immigration policies we've ever seen in the UK. And so it seems that there can be freedom for some people in some circumstances, but not freedom for others.
Well, I know, and of course, doesn't this take us back to an imperial past when we wanted everybody from our society to be able to go overseas to work, to bring wealth back, to develop themselves. So we want the freedom to send our people overseas, but we want to deny other people the freedom to come here. It's a completely ridiculous and hypocritical stance, as well as being a nonsensical one economically. So, it just again is another example of where decisions are being taken that are certainly not in Scotland's interest. I would doubt whether the decisions that are being taken are actually in anybody's interest, but they're certainly not in Scotland's interest.
Absolutely. And we'll move on to another story now that also talks about people's interests. Boris Johnson has been challenged to withdraw his Trumpian voter ID bill with a warning that it is an unnecessary policy that will disenfranchise voters from marginalised communities. Speaking at Prime Minister's questions, Ian Blackford MP challenged the Prime Minister to withdraw the vote rigging proposals, which would act as a barrier that could prevent and deter millions of people from voting. The SNP Westminster leader said, Boris Johnson must withdraw his Trumpian voter ID bill immediately. It is a completely unnecessary move, which would disenfranchise many voters from marginalised communities. The Tory government is robbing people of their democratic right to vote by introducing voter suppression measures, which would act as a barrier that could prevent and deter millions of people from voting. The Electoral Reform Society have said it could lead to voter disenfranchisement on an industrial scale, highlighting the evidence which suggests that it will hit working class communities, BAME communities, and the most marginalised groups in society. So, Roger, first of all, it's also been suggested that if this Trumpian voter ID bill is introduced, it will cost millions of pounds at each election to implement. Do you think that one would expect that the implementation would be carried out by one of a select number of corporate supporters of the Conservative Party? Do you think that this Trumpian voter ID bill is just another example of the same issues that we were discussing earlier in connection with COVID contracts?
Yes, well, I think the fundamental issue I have with the ID bill is that I'm a Democrat, and that I think in a democracy it's a good idea that it's the people that elect the government. What this bill does is Boris Johnson says he wants to elect the electorate. He wants to determine who's going to get to vote. And then what happens is he sets up a bill, and what will it do? It will do exactly as you suggested, Andrew. It will exclude predominantly those people that don't vote Tory, and it will protect those who do vote Tory. In other words, it's a simple example of a government choosing who has the right to vote in their self-interest, not in the interests of democracy. So from that point of view, I think this is a fundamental attack on democracy as we have come to know it. I think you also raised the secondary point about how is this going to be implemented. I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to have it implemented without the expenditure of very large sums of money. How will they go about it? I think you're absolutely correct, Andrew. They will contract it out. They will contract it out to organisations that probably have little knowledge of how to do this, but have very close connections with the government. And that is a further danger, a further example of the type of corrupt practices that we see from this Tory government.
It also strikes me, Roger, that in the same way as an issue we've touched on a couple of times this evening, in Scotland we know that for our last election we made significant steps in increasing the franchise by including voters of the ages of 16 and 17 and including anyone who was resident in Scotland at the time within the franchise. Do you think this is perhaps another example where there is a growing gap, a widening gulf between the priorities and the wishes of the people of Scotland and the Westminster government?
Oh, I think you raise a very important point there, Andrew. What we see again is a complete divergence in the values that are at heart here. What we're about in Scotland is extending democracy, including more people in our democracy, encouraging participation in our democracy. What we see from the UK government is precisely the reverse, a denial of democracy to more and more people at their hands, seeing democracy as their means of protecting their own interests. And so I think this is a fundamental question that we are all going to have to come together and oppose in the future. We cannot have our fellow Scots denied the right to elect their own government.
And one final question on this story, Roger. We know from recent reports that Johnson apparently is determined to attack the rights of Scots voters with his wishes to his wishes to close the Holyrood Parliament. And we now see that perhaps he is attacking the democratic rights of voters across the UK by disenfranchising them. What do you think is driving this apparently anti-democratic agenda within the Conservative Party?
Well, I think I think what we've got to recognise, if you look at the history of this, is that over the last 10 years or so, you have had the rise of a very particular and nasty form of right-wing Toryism capturing even the Tory party. And so that when I was an MP, you still had one or two figures, the likes of the Ken Clarks of this world, who would not have been tolerant of this kind of attitude of Boris Johnson. But they are largely all gone now. And of course, this raises the fundamental and interesting questions, I suppose you could say, is, has Boris Johnson's career, has he ever shown any support for democracy? I'm not aware that he's ever taken any initiative to extend and enhance democracy. I'm very aware of his career, of where he's sought a lot of personal aggrandizement and sought a lot of protection of what he sees as of his own interests. But I'm not aware he has ever been in the forefront of driving forward any purposeful democratic reform in his lifetime.
And certainly, Roger, he's not showing. I don't think he's showing any signs of attempting to or seeking to do that now. Uh, we'll move on to the next story, which brings us back to Scotland. And a contingency measure to help prisoners affected by drug use during the coronavirus pandemic is now to be rolled out to the wider community after a pilot project was shown to be a success. Last year, the Scottish Government allocated £1.9 million to support people in prison on prescribed opiate substitution treatment, OST, to switch to an alternative treatment of longer-acting buprenorphine called Buvidal. Patients can be given Buvidal every 28 days instead of having to receive medication daily, and the initiative was intended to reduce contacts during the pandemic and to mitigate against potential staff shortages as a result. A report by the Scottish Government's Health and Social Care Analysis Hub says that high levels of satisfaction about Buvidal were reported by almost all patients and healthcare staff interviewed for this research, and that the medicine had positive effects on patients' health and well-being, including a reduction in drug-seeking behaviour. So, Roger, we know that drugs policy is currently reserved to Westminster. However, this aspect, which is more to do with penal policy, which is devolved, perhaps gives an indication of the areas in which the Scottish Government can make a difference around the issues of drug use and the dangers of drug use and the damage that it does to people's lives. Do you think that this is an indication that we might see more of these initiatives and these advances from the Scottish Government?
Well, I certainly would hope so. And this is not an area where I can claim any particular expertise. But from my point of view, the key question is, with any new initiative, is do you have any evidence that it's going to work? Now, my understanding is, and as you have very fairly reported, Andrew, is that there's been a lot of studies of this pilot programme that has been undertaken in Scotland's prisons that has shown that it works. From that simple measure, from my point of view, it's therefore something to be encouraged. I would certainly hope that we hopefully will use our imagination in Scotland, that the government will use its imagination to think in other ways in which we can use, within the devolved powers, opportunities to pilot new approaches that are badly needed in this field. But to repeat myself, I think the main thing here is that we should be pleased that a pilot has been run, seemed to be effective, and therefore let's encourage its wider development.
One other aspect on this story, Roger, we know that the approach to addressing the challenges of knife crime, in particular in Glasgow, but across Scotland, the Scottish approach was to take a public health approach rather than a justice system approach to addressing those challenges. And there have been widespread calls for Scotland's approach to the problem of drug deaths to be similarly a public health approach. Do you think that this is maybe an example of the criminal justice system being at the sharp end, however, it producing results and identifying pathways which could perhaps be used in a wider setting across our wider community of people who require care and assistance in order to reduce the burden of drugs deaths that we've been seeing in Scotland?
Absolutely. This is obviously a very important issue for Scotland, given the tragic loss of life that's been involved for too long. And I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. All the evidence that I'm aware of suggests that a public health approach will have more impact and be more worthwhile in the longer run, rather than having a response that is based entirely upon the justice system, entirely upon the use of a penal type of approach to the matter. Now, of course, as you also rightly indicated, that we'll only be able to do this comprehensively is if we have all the powers, including all the powers over drug policy, some of which, of course, are retained to Westminster. So the problem is We seem to know what would work best, which is a public health approach. We seem to know how to do it. The thing that's missing is we don't have the power to do it. And that is, again, I mean, so many of the stories you've raised this evening, Andrew, come back to the same basic proposition. We are not going to get the types of improvements we will want to see until we have the power in our hands as a community to make those decisions that are necessary to improve our welfare and to lead to a better future.
Thank you, Roger. We'll come back to the pandemic for our next story, and that is that the last remaining restrictions on non-essential travel between Scotland and northwest England are to be lifted. Journeys between Scotland and Blackburn with Darwin Borough Council will be permitted for any reason from 1 minute past midnight on Thursday the 8th of July. The Public Health Minister, Marie Todd, said, "We have been carefully monitoring the situation in Scotland and across the common travel area, and following a weekly review, we will ease travel arrangements between Scotland and Blackburn. Nobody wants travel restrictions in place for any longer than is absolutely necessary. Restrictions on non-essential travel between Scotland and parts of northwest England were introduced in line with evidence and have been removed as the situation has changed." So, Roger, travel restrictions have been an enduring topic of discussion and debate during the pandemic, whether that be the accusations of delay in introducing restrictions on travel from India, which are said to have led to the seeding of the Delta variant, or as it was described today in Parliament, the Johnson variant, seeding into Bolton and then into Glasgow. And also, we know that there was considerable political commentary last summer with regard to the suggestion of travel restrictions across the border between Scotland and England. Do you think this introduction of these restrictions and then the removal, do you think that indicates perhaps that the Scottish Government is becoming more comfortable with seeking to restrict travel within, as Marie Todd said, the common travel area?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would have to say is I don't envy the Scottish Government in having to make these decisions based on evidence that seems to be changing day by day. So I think there are real difficulties that they are facing, and they're going to be damned if they do and damned if they don't, it would seem to me. So the issue in terms of the immediate decision, I don't have any problems with the immediate decision. The data that I've seen suggests that it has been falling quite quickly in recent days in the Blackburn area, and therefore provides grounds for easing this. My concern, however, and I think you've hinted at this as one of your concerns as well, Andrew, is that in the past we've had very poor actions taken to prevent the importation of variants. In the case of India, that's the most current example, but there were examples in the past. So that when we look at countries that have been very successful or relatively successful, the likes of New Zealand being the obvious case, they've had much more rigorous controls than we have ever had in the UK. And I still remain concerned about the longer term future as more variants arise as to whether we're going to take the action that will prevent the importation of yet more problems.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roger. And our final story this evening is also a COVID story, and that is that the vaccination bus run by NHS Lothian and the Scottish Ambulance Service will operate this weekend in order to reach as many over 18s as possible. This mobile unit is visiting shopping centres in West Lothian and Edinburgh as the coronavirus vaccination programme nears completion of first doses for all adults in Scotland. Meanwhile, every mainland health board continues to offer daily drop-in clinics where people can attend for their first dose or, if 8 weeks have passed, their second dose. Anyone who would prefer a scheduled appointment can continue to self-register with NHS Inform if for any reason they have not yet had their first inoculation. So, Roger, I drove past not the vaccination bus, but the drop-in vaccination centre at the Edinburgh Conference Centre this morning, and I was very pleased to see that the long line of people dropping in were all clearly young people. Having said that, most people are younger than you or me nowadays, but young people were clearly taking the opportunity to drop into the conference centre. And as I've just said, this vaccination bus, which will be at the Almondvale Shopping Centre on Friday and Saturday, and at Fort Kinnaird on Sunday, this vaccination bus is another innovation and another step forward. Do you think we should try and encourage all of the mainland all of the health boards to seek to use vaccination buses in order to push for completion of the vaccination programme?
Yes, I mean, basically my position would be as I would encourage every health board to be as imaginative as they can in trying to make sure that we vaccinate as many people as possible in as short a time as possible. Now, I know that we're constrained, of course, by having to have the supply of vaccines. But leaving that aside just for the moment, the quicker we can vaccinate people, the better. And it strikes me that if you want to have targets at the current stage of the pandemic, in my humble opinion, we would be better to have targets about we need to reach this percentage of the population before we open up, rather than having it entirely time driven. I mean, I can understand businesses wanting to know a precise time when things are going to be eased. But I think overall, it would be in our interest to maximize the way in which we're dealing with the pandemic. And at the current time, that means maximizing our approach to getting as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. So I would welcome these and any other initiatives that will help us do that.
Absolutely, as you say, the focus perhaps on data and not dates would be understandable and might be a more appropriate approach. However, that's the last of our stories, and so that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. I'd like first of all to say very many thanks to Roger Mullin for joining us this evening and for sharing with us his thoughts and insight and wisdom. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, presented by Gordon. So please tune in and join us then. So, Roger, thanks again for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland.
Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it, Andrew.
It's been great to see you. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, and I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.